100 Meters was a very refreshing production from Japan, with down-to-earth and mature writing, a relative lack of modern tropes, and unique direction. The uniqueness is most evident with the rotoscoped animation, which is very impressive for the most part, and the intentional fuzziness and shakiness of the line work added to the intensity of certain scenes. However, I do feel like the camera work and compositing could be weak, and the backgrounds were inconsistent. There were some great details in the visuals, sounds, and performances, and the music was unique and fit the film well. I liked the psychological examination of these characters, but felt like the writing could have gone a little further, and that sometimes the behaviors felt too simplistic or over the top. But those problems didn't tarnish this otherwise solid and refreshing Japanese film. I went into Hoppers intrigued because it was directed by Daniel Chong and seems to be more comedically focused than Pixar films tend to be, and I think recognizing that it was going to be less concerned than usual with tugging heartstrings helped this film be a bit of a pleasant surprise for me. Not that it's amazing by any means. I found the humor mixed and repetitive, the film was sometimes tonally confused, there were lots of little problems in the writing's logic, and while I liked the antagonists conceptually, I think their execution was weak. However, I liked the central themes and how the antagonists' parallels with the protagonists played a role in conveying them. Mabel I found a bit more interesting than most Pixar leads because she had a relatively subtle underlying motive to her behavior and understandable internal conflicts. As for presentation, the animation was really good. I'll give special mention to the shakiness of the old man and how the animation style changed to a more Warner Brothers-esque abruptness to sell some comedic bits. The visual effects were nice, the textures were kind of mixed, but hair and fur tended to be really impressive. The score had some stylistic highlights, but was otherwise pretty forgettable, and the cast overall did a decent job. Hoppers is by no means one of Pixar's best and certainly has its problems, but I thought the film was overall fairly solid and think that if you go into it with an open mind, accepting that it'll be a bit different from Pixar's normal shtick, you might be pleasantly surprised. The concept behind Eru is great, and the story integrates its inspiration well. The story itself has good setup, payoff, and the metaphor is well depicted. There's some clever art direction with great color and lighting, and good music accompanying the whole thing. The acting was a little weak and the animation was more mixed, although I liked how they used different animation techniques for different characters to aid in the storytelling. Overall, another excellent production from Cartoon Saloon. It's rare to see a small-scale short film with CG animation of this quality. For the most part, the animation, expressions, and effects were all good. Not only that, but there was some neat editing with well-done scene transitions. I also liked the sound design and mixing. The story was nothing special, but it was functional and the humor worked fairly well. All in all, Cardboard was pretty good. How refreshing it is to see something stylized that isn't going for Japanese animation. I'm not very familiar with the music of Gorillaz, so I won't comment much on that aspect, other than saying that I liked some bits of music more than others, and from my research, it seems like a lot of thought went into it. Consisting of just snippets from 3 tracks of a concept album does limit the storytelling and make interpreting the short a little difficult, although I certainly was able to pick up on some meaning in the music, symbolic imagery, and stylization choices. The animation itself looks great, with a nice mix of traditional and digital techniques that blend pretty seamlessly, although I do wish it looked a little more Xeroxed, or better yet, was Xeroxed. There were some other nice touches in the added film grain and some appropriate Disney references, although the sound work was a bit spotty. Overall, I thought this did a pretty good job of what it was going for, both stylistically and narratively, although even if understandably not the case, it would have been cool to see a film adaptation in this style that covers the whole album, as that would have made for probably a more cohesive and meaningful whole. This first entry was fairly amusing, which is aided by good expressions and vocal performances. I liked the character designs too, especially how the 2 bosses' colors are reversed. The storyboarding and animation, however, I found more mixed. Overall though, I liked Day for Angel and wouldn't mind seeing it expanded. This was not actually the first production of Accordion's Jeffrey and Mary Melodica, but the Cartoon Cartoons label gave it a bigger budget and more exposure. It has a really unique premise and presentation style, with the instruments' dialogue gimmick being pretty well done and providing some amusing and/or cute moments. I feel like this concept is fairly limited, however, probably best suited for a few short films like this rather than as a show or movie. Afternoon Super had some decent animation and a few jokes that landed, but otherwise didn't grab me. The thematic through line was obvious and not done in a particularly fresh or effective way, and the weird breaks they threw in didn't seem to serve much purpose beyond breaking the pacing with what I assume was meant to be a nostalgic throwback that didn't really add much of substance or amusement. I'm unfamiliar with the comic on which it's based, but this animated adaptation of Bird and Squirrel didn't do much for me, with writing that was weak, predictable, and over-explains everything. I did like the backgrounds and some of its use of color and editing, though. Button's Game Zone stood out tonally with its production design and dark humor. I for the most part liked the stylized art direction and animation, but I do think they got a bit carried away. I also thought that only some jokes worked, although the performances and sound design did help carry the comedy and made this more amusing than it otherwise might have been. An unthreatening Dracula trying to dominate a society while being more different, cool, and intimidating than everyone else is an amusing concept, as bizarrely specific as it is. I don't have much to say about this one though. I had mixed feelings toward the visuals, the music was alright, there were a few decent gags. I don't have many complaints, but not a whole lot of high praise either. This one was fine. Well, this was different. Duck is the first mature cartoon, and is a legitimate horror film with a few surprisingly effective disturbing moments. Aiding in this are the color, lighting, and cinematography that really help accentuate the horror. I love what they're going for with this classical-style horror premise with a clever story structure, although it is brought down a bit by some weak dialogue and character writing that makes its themes and metaphors not work quite as well as they could have. There's also some iffy character animation and a few arguably unnecessary moments, but these problems ultimately don't ruin what's otherwise probably my favorite entry so far in this batch of cartoons. A stop-motion short was a pleasant surprise, even if the animation is on the weak side, though that's somewhat understandable since I imagine the budget was tight. Not on the weak side is the impressive lighting, music that fit the aesthetic and tone, and a gibberish language that sounds surprisingly structured and natural, minus some awkwardly forced English. Yet in spite of the gibberish, the story is for the most part well conveyed and easy to follow. Overall, this was a cute, relaxing short. Fruit Stand at the End of the World has a unique style that's likely inspired by the works of Yuri Norstein, especially Hedgehog in the Fog. The visuals are overall nothing special, although some of the perspective tricks are well done. The abstract, interpretive nature of the short makes it difficult to discuss, especially considering its particularly brief length, but it did leave me pondering its meaning. So yeah, not much to say about this one other than that it was interesting, unique, and thought-provoking. This is another one I don't have much to say about. I like the casting, there are a few nice visual touches, several gags were amusing. I don't have many complaints aside from its somewhat predictable nature, but not a whole lot of praise either. Overall a fairly mediocre and forgettable, though not bad, entry. This is the pilot for a proposed series by Jorge R. Gutierrez. It was mostly an animatic, but what animation we saw was pretty good, including the expression work. And even when it wasn't animated, the storyboarding was effective for the most part, other than a few moments of bizarre staging and editing that made me a bit lost, although perhaps full animation would have fixed that. The series has an intriguing premise, but it unfortunately gets brought down by some weak, contrived writing, and while I liked some of the jokes, I think the comedy sometimes got in the way of a few scenes that I assume were meant to be more dramatic. This extends to the cast, which mostly did a good job, but the performances didn't always fit the presumed tone of certain sequences. Regardless of its flaws, however, I hope that Gutierrez gets the opportunity to expand El Guapo vs. the Narco Vampires and hopefully improve on its weak points. Tales from Outer Suburbia is an Australian production by Highly Spirited and Flying Bark based on a book series of the same name. It was aired by the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, although I was able to stream it on BYU TV. The show has a unique and intriguing premise and tone, which is aided by a distinct, effective score. Not aiding it are poor animation and textures and effects which range from surprisingly decent to pretty bad. I also found the performances underwhelming. I did like the use of 2D animation, though. The story's themes and the metaphors used to convey them do sometimes work, but they don't always and can be bogged down by otherwise often weak writing. And while the ending does an alright job tying things together, it felt rather rushed. So while the series was promising and has its qualities, I was overall left feeling a little disappointed, which is a real shame. We need more shows like this, but we also need them to be better. Shiba Yugi had a lot of potential, starting cinematic, intriguing, sometimes emotionally effective, and often clever. I especially loved the meta-narrative angle, people watching for entertainment, a broadcasted show about cute, often scantily clad girls playing games for money where they'll likely brutally die, all the while downplaying the dark reality of it with censored violence and players putting on cute archetypes that make it seem less like real people are dying. However, the approach to that concept was inconsistent, a word that could be applied to much of the show.
The art shifts are applied seemingly at random and without consistency, which makes them come across as cheap. The Monogatari-esque staging and editing is sometimes clever, but other times comes across as pretentious, a word I don't use often or lightly. The predictability makes the show less suspenseful, and when they do surprise you, it's often with cheap tricks. The writing constantly forgets its show-within-a-show premise, which makes many character behaviors unrealistic. The logic is otherwise inconsistent and often faulty, and most egregiously, the concept's execution falls short. The character writing, especially Yuki's, is occasionally deep, nuanced, and believable, which serves to the benefit of the meta-narrative, wherein the players should, behind the facade, feel like real people, but for the most part the characters feel like inhuman, shallow archetypes with insisted upon development, which makes it fall apart. Some of this could have been remedied if the season focused primarily on one game so that more time could be spent developing the characters, which would make each death more tragic and thematically appropriate. But the show, ironically, seemed more concerned with making a marketable spectacle, which goes against that meta-narrative purpose. And even if they fixed that main issue, it wouldn't fix all the other problems. So ultimately, I thought Shiba Yugi had a strong start with great potential, but quickly devolved into disappointment. I'll cut to the chase and to say that Journal with Witch is one of the best Japanese shows I've seen in a while. This is largely due to the refreshingly down-to-earth tone as well as the nuanced character writing. The varying ways introversion and extroversion can present themselves, our differing perceptions and their complexity, the assumptions we make, how expectations shape people's behavior and development, our underlying motives and feelings we may not fully understand ourselves. But it's not just the character writing. The compositing is really good for a Japanese show, Kensuke Yoshio's familiar music was fittingly lonely, and there's some clever visual storytelling and storyboarding, especially how imagination and intrusive thoughts are sometimes visualized. I'd say my biggest criticism is that the acting is a little hit and miss, but aside from that and some other small nitpicks, Journal with Witch, while not one of my all-time favorites, is really good. This was one of those shows I watched more out of obligation, because I thought it looked like a generic, underwhelming contemporary rom-com from Japan. Were my suspicions correct? Kind of? I'll start by saying that I watched this one in Japanese and English and thought both casts did a good job. I'll also concede that the character writing was relatively better than most of its contemporaries. I particularly liked the portrayal of the different ways self-consciousness can present itself and how people who are very different can be attracted to one another. But other than that, this was pretty much what I expected. Underwhelming visuals, a forgettable score, mostly weak comedy, a lack of faith in the audience being able to follow along, predictable and repetitive tropes, and other problems I would expect these days from a show like this. Some of these issues are even worse than usual, and it all ultimately soured the experience for me. If you like a lot of these recent rom-coms, then I can acknowledge that this is one of the relatively better ones. If you're like me and tends to have little patience for them, I wouldn't recommend it because its strengths aren't enough to make its flaws worth sitting through.